Merci beaucoup, Nathalie. So this presentation will be in English, so it's as inclusive as possible for the people attending. I want to start by thanking the members of the jury, Nathalie for agreeing to be the president of this session, Pierre and Ludovic for agreeing to be the reviewers for this thesis, and for your feedbacks, which have already generated some interesting reflections. Diana for coming to us from the UK, and Evelyn for can't be here today but still manages to be with us. And special thanks to everybody supporting this thesis. There's a lot of people involved in the organization. Thank you, Iris, for everything technical, Sophie for getting Ludovic, and everyone connected. We have 26 participants, a lot of which are from online, a lot of which are in Colombia and Ecuador. So I'm happy to share the results of this work called Governing Agriculture in a Changing Climate, a study of collective action for climate information in Colombia and Ecuador. This work is a thesis, part of a project financed by the French National Research Agency called D-Critical, Detecting Critical Patterns of Change in Socio-Ecological Systems based on agroforestry in Equatorial America. This project aims to identify factors which can cause critical transitions in agroforestry systems in order to design a prototype of an early warning system for this issue. I have led this thesis for a little under 3.5 years with 9 months of fieldwork in Colombia and Ecuador. We had chosen those countries because they're exposed to important climate events, which can lead some agricultural systems to undergo drastic changes or be abandoned altogether. Such was the case I discovered during my exploratory fieldwork of smallholder shaded coffee systems of Manabí. Manabí is a peculiar place to grow coffee because it's very low in elevation and it has long hot summers, which make coffee production impossible if not for a regional microclimate and by planting coffee under the shade of trees. I propose we listen to the words of a farmer I interviewed in 2022, sharing his experience of the drought.
El éxodo de la gente de Manabí fue a raíz de un fenómeno que se volvió también complicado en la provincia, con una sequía en el año 68. Fue una sequía mortal. Para que tenga una idea, que me tocó ser uno de los afectados de esa cosa, porque mi papá nosotros vivíamos de la cosecha de café y ese año no se cogió una pepa. Entonces fue un año durísimo y muchísima gente se fue. Y ahí Guayaquil está cerquita, entonces siempre digo yo que el desarrollo de Guayaquil en su gran mayoría fue con manos manabitas, juventud en miles de gente que se fue para allá y dejó botados los campos.
So as the farmer you just heard describes it, the presence of trees with coffee is not enough to counter particularly strong droughts, and such events can lead coffee systems to be massively abandoned. In the region, repeated sanitary, economic, and climate shocks have led the surface grown with coffee to drop from almost 300,000 hectares in the late 60s to only a few thousand hectares today. Anthropogenic climate change is expected to further the climate events impacting the crops, by causing additional climate variability and extreme climate events. Such transitions are already visible on coffee crops in Colombia, where they represent the means of livelihood for over 500,000 people, and where in many places the climate is no longer adapted for coffee growing, and the coffee crops are seen to be moving up to higher floors of the mountains. Now, the drought from 68 our farmer describes is not so much related to climate change as it is to another global climate phenomenon called El Niño Southern Oscillation, which consists in a cyclic alternation of El Niño and La Niña phases of respective warming and cooling of the Pacific Ocean surface temperature, which cause extreme climate events throughout the world. And so events directly impact farmers by changing crop grain conditions, but also by favoring the development of plagues or by impacting the international market and thus prices at which commodities can be sold. Now, a good thing about ENSO is that it's quite accurately predictable, and a lot of research has been done in this direction following a particularly strong 98 El Nino event. And this opens up the possibility to use predictions to adapt to incoming climate conditions and thus potentially avoid drastic climate impacts on agricultural systems. Information of varying timescales can be used to support farmer decision makings, and this information comes in many shapes. This is, for example, an extract of the Regional Agroclimatic Bulletin of Caldas, Colombia, where the following information is given. The El Niño phenomenon is active in its weakening phase. Precipitation is expected to be slightly above normal by April 2024. Therefore, it's recommended for avocado crops that, taking into account possible excess rainfall, the crop should be monitored in order to detect changes in the coloration of the foliage or tissue with necrosis. Those bulletins are made through the Mesas Técnicas Agroclimáticas, a system which constitutes Colombia's pledged strategy for agricultural climate change adaptation in the Paris Agreement. This approach for climate information is also employed for disaster risk reduction with international coordinating bodies such as the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and it's been employed in agricultural meteorology since as early as the 19th century. Its implementation is done through tools often falling into the category of either early warning systems or climate services, which consists in providing climate information to support their users' decision-making. A shared issue these approaches and tools have in common is the insufficient involvement of farmers in the provision of the information. As a result, information exists, but it is often disconnected from farmers' needs and capacities, and it hardly translates into concrete actions from their part. This is the problem we aim to tackle within this thesis. More specifically, how can we get different actors with different knowledge and backgrounds to collaborate in the co-production of climate information so that it is actionable? Formulated otherwise, the goal of this thesis is to explore the conditions to foster collective action for the co-production of climate information for farmers. Colombia and Ecuador offer ideal grounds to study this issue because of their varied agricultural systems exposed to ENSO, and the existence of climate variability and adaptation schemes whose anteriority provides us with examples to reflect on and project ourselves on potential institutions to adapt to climate change. I thus pursued this goal by investigating empirical case studies in Colombia and Ecuador using ethnographical methods during my field trips. Through the analysis of these case studies using institutional economics, I will show multiple determinants of the collective provision of climate information, but also how this process ties into the determination of agricultural systems in these countries, a key point that constitutes the title of my thesis and which I will develop in the rest of this presentation. To study the provision of climate information, I have built upon Elinor Ostrom and the Bloomington School's theory on collective action. Elinor Ostrom is famous for developing the economic theory on the provision of public goods and services beyond the previously existing dichotomy of either state or market-based regulations. Her work on common pool resources show that users of such resource can self-organize durably for their management. Among their key principles underlying these self-organized institutions, Elinor and her husband Vincent Ostrom advocate for the benefits of polycentric systems, which are systems comprising multiple decision centers interacting with some level of autonomy. As of yet, some work has studied the efforts for climate change mitigation using polycentric systems, but little work has been done on climate change adaptation using this scope. In addition, the works on the commons expanded from common pool resources to include intangible objects such as knowledge or information and identify specific social dilemmas associated with their production and management. These works provide various insights from which we can learn and a background against which the specifics of climate information provision can be compared and analyzed. The work at the Bloomington School is deeply empirically grounded, something that is achieved through the systematic study of cases using the analytical frameworks developed by Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues. I will briefly present two of those, the first being the Institutional Analysis and Development, or IAD, initially proposed by Kisser and Ostrom in 1982. The IAD seeks to define several categories that constitute the generic building blocks underlying repeated human interaction and outcomes. Its central unit of analysis is the action arena, a setting in which actors interact and produce outcomes, which are determined by several variables, which are the material and biophysical conditions affecting the arena, the attributes of the community of the participating actors, and the rules in application within each action arena. The idea offers to look at action arenas not as isolated elements, but as connected within a network where the outcome of one influences the others. Because of the importance of the works on common pool resources, the IAD evolved to pay more attention to the biophysical and ecological foundation of institutions, which led to the creation of the socio-ecological systems framework. Its focal point remains the action arenas, but the exogenous factors affecting them have evolved to depict the characteristics of the social and ecological components of the embedded systems, which are divided into various sets of variables. In my thesis, I propose to combine both the IAD and the SES into an analytical framework tailored to study the provision of climate information. This framework is based on two hypotheses. The first one is that the characteristics of the agricultural socio-ecological systems using climate information influence the process for information provision. We posit that factors like the sensibility of crops to climate variation, the possibility to alter agricultural practices to account for different climate conditions, the farmers' knowledge on climate, or the levels of associations between farmers are going to affect the incentives and capacity of farmers to engage in the co-production of climate information, because they will modify the perceived costs and benefits of doing so. As climate information is going to affect agricultural systems in a certain way, we propose the existence of feedback loops between the climate services and agricultural systems. Now, the problem with this representation is that it doesn't illustrate the complex processual nature of climate services. Indeed, providing climate information starts with observation systems made of meteorological stations, satellites, or radars, generating meteorological data, meaning values of observed variables describing the states of the atmosphere, such as temperature, humidity, solar radiations, etc. And meteorological data then serves as an input to models which turn it into climate information, such as seasonal forecasts, which may need to be further transformed before being disseminated in a format fitting the needs and the capacities of farmers. I argue that the processual nature of climate services must be considered to solve the collective provision of climate information on the account of my second hypothesis that specific collective action problems and action arenas networks occur at the various steps of the climate information provision process. Hence, it's necessary to identify the right scale to design specific institutional arrangements to solve the dilemmas occurring at each step. To test and illustrate the relevance of these hypotheses, I have conducted 3 studies on situations occurring at various steps of the process. In each study, which map the chapters 2 to 4 of my thesis, we have used different analytical and theoretical frameworks stemming from the Bloomington School to identify complementary factors influencing the climate information provision process. To document these studies, I have used ethnographic methods based mostly on participant observation and semi-structured interviews. In total, I conducted 69 interviews with a variety of actors, most of which were from formal organizations in Colombia and Ecuador. I did participant observation of over 15 events related to climate and agriculture and visited over 10 farms. My observations were noted down in a field journal and my interviews were transcribed into written text. Along with the documents I collected, all the material was indexed in a corpus before being analyzed. My analysis was done using MaxQDA as a software to code the data, an operation for which I used categories stemming from the specific analytical frameworks used for each case, which I complemented with additional categories that appeared relevant throughout the coding process. This was done in order to organize my data, as coded segments were later transcribed into the various information they contained and confronted to other segments yielding similar or contradictory information for triangulation. Later, emerging patterns or plausible causal links identified in the data were then presented in our results section. In the rest of this presentation, we will zoom in and out of these situations I studied before reflecting on what doing so teaches us for the analysis of climate information provision. So, in our first study, I asked what are the factors that lead actors within agricultural socio-ecological systems to acquire climate information. To do so, we come back to our original testimony on coffee and agroforestry systems in Manabí, which we compare with the coffee monocrop systems in the Department of Caldas, Colombia. As I explained in introduction, coffee systems in Manabí collapsed under repeated sanitary, climate and economic shocks. And to our surprise, Colombian coffee systems have endured the same pressures but maintained high levels of production. This was surprising because agroforestry systems such as those we found in Manabí are supposed to be resilient to climate variations because of the buffer effect trees provide to the system. To the contrary, Colombian coffee is currently mostly cultivated under full sun monocrops, hence potentially more susceptible to climate variations. To understand this apparent paradox, we have further explored the factors for climate resilience in both systems, with a special focus on the role of climate information and its acquisition by actors within those systems. To do so, we have engaged in comparing their history with a special attention to their social ecological characteristics potentially influencing their capacity and incentives to acquire climate information. I have conducted 23 semi-structured interviews with farmers to document those systems. 23 semi-structured interviews with farmers, association representatives, and actors from the agricultural sector in Colombia and Ecuador. I recorded my observation of 10 farm visits and did participant observation of several climate and related agriculture events, such as field school days or a conference of the effects of El Niño at the Cenicafe Research Center. I guided this data collection with Elina Ostrom's socio-ecological systems framework, which I used to code the interviews transcripts using the MaxQDA software. I then wrote monographs describing both systems before extracting the relevant information for my question. Now, a common point brought up by farmers in both countries was the disruption of climate patterns which they use to plan their agricultural operations. Climate change causes seasons to start later, last longer, or not occur at all, thus highly disturbing major medium-term agricultural decision-making like sowing dates and causing mismatches between their crops' needs and the environmental conditions they grow in. Those pattern disruptions create new needs for climate information to support decision-making, but not all farmers are equal in their capacity to acquire climate information. The main discriminating factor we found for access to climate information in the system was the level of farmers' organization in both countries. In Ecuador, the historical failure of cooperative developments led to poor social capital and a weak farmers' organization sectors composed of scattered small associations. On the other hand, the development of Colombia's rural landscape was shaped by sprawling mega organizations, agricultural national federations, financed by parafiscal funds and dedicated to developing the farming of specific crops such as coffee, cereals, etc. While climate information for farmers was almost non-existent in Ecuador, Colombian coffee farmers benefited from their federations, extensionists, and research centers Cenicafe to provide them with tailored climate information. Senicafe was one of the first actors to install meteorological stations in the coffee producing area. And the agroclimatic information devised by Senicafe's agrometeorologists benefits from a large network of federation extensionists, which constitute a tremendous force for its dissemination to farmers. The preponderance of the Coffee Federation in the farmers' lives is such that it has practically transformed the coffee growing landscape. Their action of pushing disease-resistant, sun-tolerant coffee varieties has led to a strong intensification of coffee production, inducing a massive transformation from agroforestry systems towards monocropping. Now, the socio-ecological properties of our studied systems led us to formulate a new hypothesis to explain the paradoxical demise of Ecuadorian agroforestry systems by introducing the concept of resilience traps. To define this concept, we distinguish between short and long-term resilience of agricultural systems. Resilience traps, as we define them, exist when the short-term climate resilience of agroforestry systems leads to lower long-term resilience by reducing farmers' incentives to acquire climate information to adapt to climate variations. In other words, because monocrop systems in Caldas are more sensitive to climate variation, they have more incentive to acquire climate information to manage their crops, which can contribute to their long-term resilience. To the contrary, farmers of agroforestry systems in Manabí may not feel an urgent need for such information because trees made their crops somewhat resilient to short-term climate variations, but they are thus more vulnerable to strong climate events or long-term changes, which they could have anticipated using this information. Now, our purpose here is not to state that monocrops supported by climate information is an ideal model for climate adaptation. Yes, Colombian system coffee farmers can rely on forecasts to adapt to incoming climate conditions, but they have lost the ecologically and economically resilient structure of agroforestry systems in order to maximize immediate profits. Incidentally, the Coffee Federation is criticized for not succeeding to lift a majority of coffee farmers out of poverty and for causing a loss of biodiversity in cultivated systems. Resilience traps could thus contribute to a selection of more intensive systems compared to less desirable one. More desirable one, sorry. Introducing the concept of resilience traps is thus intended to provide hints as to where climate information is likely to be lacking and enable relevant support accordingly. It also highlights specific situations where climate information is likely to be little valued by individual actors. This is what led Perels and colleagues to describe climate information as a merit good, a type of good undervalued by its consumers and thus deeming state support to enable its full potential benefit for society. This situation leads to a further question related to our initial problem, which is how do we get actors who have little incentive to acquire climate information to engage in its co-production? And this is what we have investigated in the following chapter, where we offer to look at climate information as an informational commons. In this chapter, we have used Euler's definition of the commons as a normative framework for collective action for climate adaptation. Euler breaks from Ostrom's proposition of common pool resources as a fixed type of goods and builds upon others' work to formalize the definition of the commons as the social form or shape given to matter when people interact with it through the practice of commoning, which he defines as the voluntary and inclusively self-organized activities and mediations of peers who aim at satisfying needs. This definition represents a governance model that can be relevant to address the specific issues related to climate information co-production, including issues of actionability, mediation between different types of knowledge, equity, and climate justice. How governments can incite farmers to build the commons around climate information is what we have studied by reflecting on Colombia's experience in devising a participative process for local agroclimatic information provision called Mesas Técnicas Agroclimáticas, or MTAs in short. The MTA system was created following a particularly strong La Niña event in 2011, after which actors from the agricultural sector organized to better manage climate risks. The MTAs gather meteorologists and actors from the agricultural sector in regional monthly meetings to discuss climate predictions. This is, for example, a screenshot of the meeting of one of Colombia's 32 departments, Caldas, where participants met online. This is a picture I took in the village of Barichara, in the department of Santander, where two representatives from the cereals federations are presenting information to farmers and inhabitants from the village. And this is a third picture of Risaralda department's MTA meeting, where you have a representative from the risk management unit of the department's capital city hall. And attending, you have several representatives from agricultural federations, but also people from the National Park Services, Environmental Authority, and health regulations who are attending the meeting because they find an interest in the information that is presented here. After the meetings, agroclimatic bulletins gathering seasonal climate forecasts and agricultural practices recommendations are created and disseminated to support farmers' decision-making. MTAs have become the key axis in Colombia's government's strategy for agricultural climate change adaptation, pledging to cover its territory with MTAs by law and in its nationally determined contributions attached to the Paris Agreements. They were later spread to other countries in Latin America by the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. To study the MTAs, I have conducted participant observation of 5 departmental MTA meetings and 2 national meetings. I also conducted, recorded, and transcribed 30 semi-structured interviews with actors involved in the MTAs. I used the institutional analysis and development framework to organize my data collection and analysis, which led me to map the network of action arenas of the Colombian MTAs and their participating actors. So this map is appearing on the screen right now. Without getting into the details of this map, what it suggests is that the MTA system remains rather descending from national institutions towards local actors. On the one hand, MTAs have managed to generate important amount of information with over 500 agroclimatic bulletins we were able to recover since the beginning of the tax initiative, the MTA's initiative. And on the other hand, we observed little farmers' participation in the process, resulting in information with varying capacity to support farmers' decision-making. Instead, information is often overly abundant and technical for farmers' needs, as is evidenced by this extract from a bulletin, which you have to imagine most farmers would be reading from their phone. Mapping out action arenas also enabled us to identify arenas with blockage points, such as some that are related to the robustness of regional MTAs. Regional MTAs were either led by a local government or by an agricultural federation. Regional MTAs led by a local government were often dependent on the support of a technical secretary hired by the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development and prone to cease activities when this support failed. On the contrary, MTAs led by a federation benefited from a more durable resources to function, but they were also more exclusively focused on a single crops like maize, rice, or sugarcane. This was evidenced by a meeting led by Cenicaña, the research center on sugarcane in the Valle del Cauca department, where the meteorologist from Cenicaña presented those maps of the climate forecast for the coming months. Now, this is a map of the Valle del Cauca department, and it may surprise you to see that the shapes of the maps presented in the MTA meeting and the map of the department do not match. It becomes more clear why when you look at the topographical map of Valle del Cauca and you see that the information presented actually only matches the flat area of the department where intensive sugarcane production is held. MTAs thus do not support all farmers equally. Agroclimatic bulletin written in a technical language and disseminated through WhatsApp favor farmers with superior education and connectivity. As we mentioned, agroclimatic bulletins were more fit to be used by agricultural technicians than farmers. And incidentally, there is a tremendous difference of capacity between agricultural federations for extensionism and local governments. Providing information whose information is restricted to extensionists de facto supports federation rather than all farmers indiscriminately. The commons can be used as a normative reference to address these issues. The multiple elements of Euler's definition of the commons provide a scale from which we can draw to identify which elements are currently lacking for the agroclimatic information produced in MTAs to be considered the commons, so we can work towards them to achieve greater equity, climate justice, and integration of traditional knowledge in the MTAs. Drawing from the principles for successful commons management, we look at Carlisle and Grubby's enabling factors for the benefits of polycentric systems to diagnose that the lack of formal rules defining roles and responsibilities leads to unclear governance and arenas dominated by the currently most powerful actors. To foster effective state-supported self-governance, we hence formulate the recommendation that an overarching set of rules should be set up to account for power imbalances and ensure more inclusivity in the voices being heard within the MTAs. If the Colombian MTAs illustrate the difficulty to engage farmers in the co-production of climate information, building institution is also a timely process in which they're engaged. Our institutional analysis of their current state, asking how we can work from there and try building a commons, highlight factors impeding their social performance, but also levers upon which to act to support effective and equitable climate adaptation. Investigating the MTAs also led us to encounter a massive potential barrier for climate information production, which was the lack of sufficient local meteorological data to build relevant climate information in Ecuador. Indeed, as we tried to investigate the development of the MTAs in Ecuador, we found that an initial project had been launched in the late 2010s, but didn't generate results. This was due to several factors, but a predominant reason impeding the launch of the MTAs was the absence of a base local climate information upon which to build agricultural recommendations. This is actually a problem in many countries with low to middle income who suffer from a lack of capacity in the area of national hydrometeorological services. It is the case of Ecuador, where the National Meteorological Institute, the INAMI, suffered from budget cuts, reducing the number of meteorological stations they manage from over 700 nationwide to only 30 at the time of investigations in 2022. This is important because although we now have access to a plethora of data generated by satellites in Andean countries, managing sufficiently dense meteorological stations networks is still crucial to generate quality predictions because of a complex climate and topography generated high variability and many local microclimates. To compensate for national deficiencies in this area, several actors in Colombia and Ecuador have successfully collaborated to pool their resources and manage common meteorological networks. We have studied those collaborations in order to understand the underlying key to their success and explore how public-private collaborations can provide open meteorological networks. To do so, we drew from Brett Frischman's work on infrastructure applied to meteorological networks provision. Infrastructures, according to Frischman, can be consumed non-rivalrously for a large range of demand, which is driven by downstream productive activities that use the resource as an input. This enables the production of a wide range of goods and services. Similarly, meteorological networks and the data they generate enable the production of a wide array of private, public, and social goods with weather and climate forecasts, early warning systems, project plannings, etc. Thinking of meteorological networks as infrastructures invites us to think not only of the technical requirements they need to meet to enable the production of relevant information products, but also how they must be open to yield large societal benefits. In a context where national institutions fail to provide such infrastructures, our issue hence rests on understanding the key to successful collaborations to do so. To identify the factors enabling such agreements, we have applied a transactions costs approach to case studies where actors self-organize to manage open meteorological networks in the province of Pichincha, surrounding the capital of Quito, Ecuador, and Caldas, Colombia. I documented these collaborations through 9 semi-structured interviews with the actors involved, whose transcripts were coded with a special focus on the costs associated with each collaboration. I see time is advancing, so I will probably skip a little over this part where I present the details of these collaborations and advance to our more general results. Maybe I'll just give an information on the collaboration for CIMAC, in which is the Integrated Environmental Monitoring System of Caldas, which is an initiative led by the local seat of the Colombian National University, in close collaboration with the departmental environmental authority and various private actors, including hydroelectrical companies, a sanitation company, water providing company, etc. These actors pooled their resources and they pooled their meteorological stations into a common network managed by the National University, totaling 130 stations, whose data is openly shared on the CIMAC platform. Now, our results on studying both case studies show that collaborating enabled actors to access the data of a much larger and denser network of meteorological stations, which they could if they tried to manage those networks on their own. Pooling resources with other actors reduces individual costs to access a large quantity of quality meteorological data to answer their needs. This collaboration also enabled the development of information products such as early warning systems against flooding in Caldas, but also research to better understand the functioning of local watersheds, with applications that are highly relevant to the participating actors. Although the CIMAC's data is open and some actors expressed fears of freeloading from others who could access it without contributing to the network, the ability to join the negotiations steering the research for applications relevant to one's needs constitutes a tremendous incentive for contributing to the CIMAC. Collaborating generates new coordination costs, which were limited by several factors, which we found to be instrumental for the success of the studied collaborations, such as the number of actors involved, the existence of shared norms and a common language between scientists and technicians. Trust also facilitates negotiations, and for example, in the case of the CIMAC, many officials or head of organizations involved in the collaboration were former students of the National University, which facilitate negotiations engaged with their former teachers. And finally, a favorable environment and a regulatory framework enables individuals willing to promote collaboration and open data principles. The fact that the environmental authority charged with enforcing regulations and delivering environmental permits was involved in the cooperation in Caldas was also an interesting configuration, facilitating the involvement of actors which were initially reluctant to share the data openly. Overall, we found that the characteristics of public and private actors were quite complementary to generating durable collaborations for meteorological infrastructure, as is illustrated by this quote from an interviewee from the FONAG in Ecuador, speaking about INAMI, the National Meteorological Services in Ecuador. And he says, INAMI as a rector for us has been first been a consultant because it was with them that we set our first stations up. So it was a very good consultancy because everyone can speak very badly of INAMI, but their technicians are good. They have knowledge and experience. What they couldn't do in their own institution, they helped us do, which is to say, to have a sustainable meteorological network and to think very carefully about everything we need for this network to work in the long term. All in all, these public-private collaborations enable actors to overcome individual limitations to access meteorological infrastructure. And most of all, they enable the production of services like early warning systems and research using this meteorological data as an input. What is particularly interesting in our case is the conjunction of actors being providers of data and users of the resulting information products at the same time, effectively engaging in the co-production of said products. When coordination costs are managed to remain sufficiently low, our case studies show that collaborations between public and private actors emerge as a viable option for the provision of meteorological infrastructure. Multiplying and coordinating such collaborations in a polycentric system could be a path forward to solving the provision of local data at larger scales and support broader climate adaptation schemes. So, what have we learned in this thesis? We have engaged in exploring the conditions to foster collective action for the co-production of climate information for farmers. In chapter 2, our study on coffee-based socio-ecological system departs from the concept of adaptability as a component of resilience and Falk and colleagues' differentiation between specified and general resilience. We, on the other hand, highlight trade-offs between adaptability and the general resilience of system and differentiate between the short and long-term resilience to introduce the new concept of resilience traps. We show the necessity of a socio-ecological approach to plan climate adaptation on the long term by supporting socially and ecologically desirable systems where climate information is likely to be lacking. How users can organize to collectively manage an intangible resource is the focus of Hess and Alstrom's Knowledge Commons. In chapter 3, we have applied a commons approach to climate information, an original object of study due to, among others, the fact that it's considered as a merit good by researchers like Perez and colleagues, because it's undervalued by users compared to its potential long-term benefits. Using Euler's definition of the commons centered around a multi-dimensional social practice, we propose an approach for building a commons as a normative approach for state-reinforced self-governance for climate adaptation. Applied to climate information, this approach turns into a basis for an operational framework to build climate information co-production schemes, which allowed us to formulate recommendations for Colombian mesas técnicas agroclimáticas to advance towards more equity and social performances. Finally, investigating meteorological stations network as infrastructures led us to build upon Carol Rose's and Yoshai Benkler's analysis of the importance of positive externalities in open regimes. We add to this analysis by highlighting the added incentives to participate in collaborations for open infrastructures when actors are involved in the co-productions of these externalities. By analyzing the transactions costs involved, we identify factors enabling such collaborations and highlighted the potential for public-private collaborations rather than outsourcing public services to overcome states' deficiencies in providing meteorological infrastructures. Crossing our studies seems to support our hypothesis that different collective action problems occur at the various steps of the climate information provision process. As a consequence, polycentric systems appear as a solution to devise and connect multiple local operational arrangements solving individual problems. However, while studies on knowledge commons had strayed away from the tangible dimension of socio-ecological systems, we tried to reconnect these dimensions by connecting the collective action for an intangible resource climate information with the tangible agricultural socio-ecological systems using the resource. In doing so, we showed the existence of feedback between the agricultural system and the information provision process, stressing the need for careful and proactive institutional design in order to avoid reinforcing existing power dynamics. Especially in polycentric system, as is pointed out by several authors, that these systems can lead to an underrepresentation of actors who have limited capacities, especially in the global south, or enable powerful actors to manipulate the system for personal interest. This in turn can lead to climate injustices with the inequitable distribution of rights, benefits, burdens, and responsibilities related to climate change. This is especially significant in a context where resilience traps can already lead to a selection by favoring systems with the most incentives to acquire climate information, although they may fail to bring the most social or ecological benefits to farmers. Overall, this thesis suggests that it is possible to foster collaborations overcoming collective action problems for the provision of climate information through systems that are resilient to shocks as budget cuts or political changes. In places where national actors have limited capacities, these collaborations gain from breaking free from silos, whether the silos are constituted by different approaches and tools, whether they are sectoral, or just created by designing climate service provision by exclusively public or private actors. Climate information carries many unseen ramifications, some of which can go as deep as the ontological ground from which they are produced and where they are disseminated. Through this thesis, we show how climate services go beyond just providing farmers with weather intel, but are actually, in many ways, a component of agricultural governance. Through the careful study of feedbacks on agricultural socio-ecological systems and by highlighting factors for the successful co-production of climate information, we hope this work contributes to paving the way for a desirable future with equitable and just climate adaptation.
Après une longue délibération, tous les membres du jury présents à l'unanimité, on se prononce pour une admission au grade de doctorat de l'université Paris-Saclay et voulais te féliciter pour cette capacité à mener un tel travail pluridisciplinaire. Évidemment, cette admission, elle est sous réserve de finalisation du dépôt légal de la thèse, c'est-à-dire qu'on ne te demande pas de faire des grosses corrections, mais certains ont noté des petites corrections, et donc c'est un engagement de ta part, avec tes directrices de thèse, de faire ces corrections de manuscrits. Aussi de finaliser les 2 manuscrits en cours de publication, parce que ça aussi c'est très important. Et puis aussi, il va falloir que tu prononces faut que tu prêtes serment. Donc, tu as le texte, sinon je l'ai là. Et après ça, on pourra vraiment l'applaudir. Voilà.
Je vais créer un tout petit peu de suspense. Je voudrais juste remercier déjà les membres du jury d'avoir accepté de participer à ce jury et pour la richesse des discussions aujourd'hui. Remercier les gens du projet des Criticales avec qui on a fait un bout de chemin ensemble pendant ces 3 ans, toutes les personnes de l'unité dont je peux dire que je me suis senti extrêmement soutenu ces derniers mois et j'ai apprécié mon temps à SADAPT et bien sûr mes encadrantes et déjà Armelle pour le gros investissement que tu as mis dans ma thèse et voilà, la disponibilité et tout le travail que tu as mis dedans et je pense qu'ils m'ont vraiment permis d'évoluer, voilà, de devenir donc aujourd'hui docteur en sciences économiques. Et Annge-Gaël, où tu as mentionné des passages qu'on a fait sur le terrain ensemble et je pense que pour illustrer tes qualités humaines, il suffit de rencontrer des personnes vers qui tu m'as envoyé pour faire du terrain que tu connaissais et qui m'ont juste ouvert leurs portes de chez eux de façon inconditionnelle, aveuglément, juste sur la simple fait que j'étais envoyé par toi et qu'à partir de là, ils pouvaient bien me laisser leur chambre. Et voilà, je te remercie pour tout ce que j'ai appris à tes côtés, notamment en termes de posture de chercheur dans un pays qui n'est pas le mien, et sur les relations humaines que j'ai pu y mener. Et je vais maintenant dire le serment. En présence de mes pairs, parvenu à l'issue de mon doctorat en sciences économiques et ayant ainsi pratiqué dans ma quête du savoir l'exercice d'une recherche scientifique exigeante, en cultivant la rigueur intellectuelle, la réflexivité éthique et dans le respect des principes de l'intégrité scientifique, je m'engage pour ce qui dépendra de moi dans la suite de ma carrière professionnelle, quel qu'en soit le secteur ou le domaine d'activité, à maintenir une conduite intègre dans mon rapport au savoir, mes méthodes et mes résultats.